Hi everyone, welcome to Backstage for the Making Apps Beautiful series. We're actually going to be doing two Backstage episodes, so they're based on the Android Dev Bytes Making Apps Beautiful. So far we've had parts 1, 2 and 3 available, and here's your opportunity to join us and ask questions. So to get started, I'm Anko Cotwell, and I'm a developer advocate here in the Sydney office.
Yeah, and I'm Jan Felix Schmark, and I'm an Android developer programs engineer, also here in Sydney, obviously.
So we tried doing this once before, and we had some technical problems, so hopefully we're all going to be good to go today. So thanks for joining us. We have a number of questions that have been submitted before the event started. But we also have a number of people joining us live.
Yeah, that's right. So if you have a question on the Hangout, just ping us, write something in the chat, and we'll put you up and you can ask your question live. But to get started, let's go to one of our first questions we received on our Plus page before. And this question is coming from Hannes Dorfman, and he's asking about transparent action bars. So if I make an action bar transparent, will the content of a component that has match parent height, for instance, the main activity layout set with set content view, automatically be stretched and visible underneath the action bar? And do you think it's generally a good idea? For example, like we're doing it in the Google Play Music app, for example.
And the Grand Street is.
And the Grand Street app.
So let's split this question up into two. The first is about getting an action bar that actually floats above your content. The way you do that is actually by specifying an XML attribute in your layouts called action bar window overlay. So if you set this, basically what it will do is put the action bar on top and the content behind it. With that content behind it, then what that means is that you can take advantage of things like the transparent action bar. So for example, Google Music, we use that transparent action bar to show you the imagery for the artist or the album. So what happens is when you see the artist to start with, the action bar starts off transparent, and then as you scroll, it becomes more opaque. Now that's a really nice effect, because what it does is it actually helps to retain the visual branding that we're trying to get with that orange color of the Play Music app, but we're also trying to give away that screen real estate for that rich media. So as we're at the very top, you can see it, and then as you scroll, it sort of becomes opaque over time. So it's a really nice effect.
So when do you think it would make sense to include this in your application?
I think it's typically where you need real estate back, so you've got a decent amount of content that you kind of you want to take up that space that action bar might be using. And in particular, it's actually when you have rich media like images. So we have this artist profile here, so in Play Music. Now Grand Street is interesting because they use a transparent action bar throughout, and again what they're doing is they're sort of taking away the Chrome or the UI elements. So they're actually, what they do is that you'll see that around their buttons in their action bar, so their action items, they've got some sort of translucent borders, but the main section of the action bar, because they're not actually displaying anything, they're choosing to make that transparent. And I mean, the question was, do you like the general idea? To be honest, this is more of a design question, and it depends on your design. If you're trying to really showcase those beautiful images that you may or may not have in your app, then a transparent action bar makes sense. But if you want to retain that sort of brand identity, then go ahead and keep an opaque or opaque color or an image there.
Okay. Yep.
Okay. So Hans, I think it's Hans, had another question as well, saying, I saw the Google Play redesign video, and he was referring to the Android Design in Action episode that we had for that, and said, I'm a fan of the card principle and would like to implement something like that in my next app. I'm wondering how they achieve an adapter that works with different card sizes. Is it a simple list view that inflates, for instance, a horizontal linear layout that already contains one big card and two medium cards and four small cards, and he's given us an image there, or is it a grid view with a special view adapter? Can you give any hint on how to implement something like this? Well, so rather than focusing on specifically what that implementation is, what I'd be saying is have a look at what works well with your code. So having a list view with a linear layout in it is not a bad idea, not a bad way to do it. You don't have to use a linear layout. You could use a relative layout, and in some ways, a relative layout might be a bit more flexible for allowing you to vary the number of cards. So what I'd be doing is basically in my adapter, I'd be keeping track of, do I need to present this as a big card, or, well, if you have 3 sizes, a small, medium, large, and then dynamically try and set the proportions accordingly. So we don't currently have any real sample code there that shows developers how to do this, but you could envisage that if you're dynamically loading creating these views, it shouldn't be too hard. Once you know your heuristic to work out what size the card should be, you can easily just kind of say, hey, I want it to be, double the size of this or not. So yeah, I mean, it's all about dynamically loading it in.
Okay.
I hope that answers your questions, Hans. Now we have a few people that have joined us on the Hangout, so maybe we'll take this opportunity to see if they want to ask us any questions.
So we have a question from Marty here. Marty, do you want to come live on the Hangout, or is it okay if we just read out your question? Can do both.
Well, I'm not hearing anything, so why don't we just go ahead and ask.
So Marty is asking about any tips on getting the search working on the action bar. I want to have my user enter an address and have Google Maps V2 search for it and place a marker. Oh, hi Marty, we have you live on the
There we go.
How's it going?
Good. You've got glass on. I thought you might join us from glass. But
yeah, that's
all
right.
Okay.
Nope, can't do that yet.
So, any tips for getting the search working on the action bar? So, are you talking about like a search view?
Yeah, I'm trying to do a search view and can't seem to get it to where I can search in my app.
So, are you talking about at a presentation level, or are you talking about the integration of like doing the search operation, so the indexing and the looking up of the keywords?
I'm adding a search view on the option menu, and I want to have that just for that particular fragment. I want to have it search an address on the map, actually.
Oh, on the map.
On the map. Yeah.
So would you like the map to kind of pan around as the results start to show?
Actually, what I want it to do is, if I can get it to search for the address, I'm going to have it then put a marker and then pan to that marker.
Got you. So can I just ask one more question? Are you looking for sort of autocomplete as well there? So I mean, it's an address, so people may not be typing in the whole thing. They might be expecting an autocomplete.
This is just my first shot at it, so that'd be nice, but it's not a must-have right now.
Okay. So I mean, what I'd be looking for is just using our standard search view that we have, and it's you've asked this question at a really good time because we're about to publish some documentation around this very shortly. So on best practices on how to integrate the search view. So I think that will actually solve your questions. But was there something specific that you were being held back in?
I just haven't seen a good example of how to do it, so I was looking for guidance, really.
Okay.
You might also want to look at the geocode API, so you can give it an address and it would give you a lat long back. And it's just an API, it's a Google Maps API, so you can look it up online. It's just a normal API you can call, you get back a lat long, and then you can just use a normal map view, add marker and change the camera and those kind of things. And just interact with
yeah, I'm able to do that. I'm able to do that right now. I'm just not able to put it in that search in the options menu.
Okay. Have you had a look at the creating a search interface API guide that we have on developer.android.com?
No, but I'll go take a look at that.
Yeah, that one goes through it in a good amount of detail. So I'd suggest start there, and if you still have troubles, then join us next time again.
Exactly.
Creating a search interface?
Yeah.
I'll take a look at it. Thank you.
Okay, no worries. Thanks for joining us. So, is there anyone else that would like to ask a question on the Hangout? If you are interested in asking a question, please just let us know on the chat, and then we can unmute you and have you join.
Put you up on the screen.
So in the meantime, we'll move on to the next sort of question that we had there.
So we've been in the first 2 or 3 parts, we've been talking about making your app beautiful, right? And we've been kind of talking about what a beautiful app really should be like, and what makes an app really beautiful, right? So, and we've been talking about modernizing an app, but the question really is, how do you spot a non-modern app? What makes an app not beautiful these days?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'll admit that when I fire up an Android app, I'm almost immediately able to sense whether this is a modern app or not. And I sat down when this question came up. I sat down and I thought, well, what are the cues that give it away? Because it's obvious to me, but sometimes if you go into the details, it's harder to kind of specify exactly what. And I actually found that there was a number of things. So firstly, it's the legacy menu button. This one's really, really important because there are tons of phones out there that now have virtual navigation buttons, but in particular, the vast majority of tablets don't have a physical menu button. They have virtual buttons. So if you're not targeting the latest SDK, or rather if you're not targeting API 11 and up, you're going to start to see that legacy menu button. And often, actually, most people don't even put a menu in there because we've kind of, when Android first came about, we had these user interfaces that were designed around having a menu that wasn't necessarily visible. The action bar and the action overflow basically improved that so that you could see when you had actions available to you, and in that way it replaced what the menu button did, but in a more powerful manner, because you could choose what to show, give things priority, have it automatically stack or split. So there were a lot of advantages that came with that. So if I'm seeing a legacy menu button, usually to me that's a sign that developers aren't keeping up. They're not staying modern, and frankly, API 11's been out for a long, long time now.
I was going to ask, what's a quick fix? What's the easiest thing you can do to get rid of the menu button?
Actually, so we covered it in episode 1. It's that target SDK version. That's what you should be setting. And as we said there, that won't necessarily break backward compatibility because you have the min SDK version attribute that you can specify in your manifest to make sure that you're still showing up on all the devices. So legacy menu button is the first one. The next one is actually using a non-holo theme. And by that, we don't mean that every single app needs to look the same or have the same holo colors. But you know when an app is following the holo theme, right? You can see the way text fields are specified, the way you get touch feedback. There's just, if you're targeting an older version of Android, it's immediately apparent in the way the dialogues are styled. If you've got that hideous title bar across the top, we've moved with the time. So using a modern theme is a good thing.
And especially if you have an app that you've tested on something more modern, it's just really easy to specify a different theme for, ice cream sandwich in a buff, for example. And immediately you're getting the holo theme in dialogues and, your other input UI elements as well. So it's really easy to actually, get out of the way. And it's so obvious, right? If you get a dialogue that doesn't look like a holo dialogue, it's just stands out.
So legacy menu button, non-holo theme. The third one for me is the action bar. So the lack of an action bar tells me that you're either you're paying a lot of attention to detail and you're building a really custom experience that you feel is better than the action bar. And that's okay. That's an endeavor that we encourage. Innovation is always a good thing. But often what I find is apps that aren't using an action bar are actually they're kind of an old style app. So it breaks that sense of consistent navigation for your users, because when they use their Android devices, whether it's a phone or a tablet, the apps that ship with the system and the sort of top apps that tend to get featured or are popular will tend to use the Android design guidelines. So if you're not using those guidelines, don't do it because of sheer laziness. If you're going to go against the guidelines or do something custom, do it because you truly are building an experience that is superior to the default one. So, three things.
So the action bar is an interesting one. It always tends to come up. So let's talk about it in a bit more detail. So let's say you already have established branding, like you have some logos, you're using some colors or something. How would you include that with your action bar? Because the action bar would be at the top, and people tend to put logos there or something similar in some other apps.
Yeah, the action bar is more for having a consistent sort of interaction design. We still encourage you to have your own branding, have your own logos, theme it, and that's what really episode 1 of the DevByte series, Making Apps Beautiful, was all about. theming it so that it's consistent with your guidelines. It's really important though that you put in things like the app icon, because it again allows you to establish your identity, the identity of your app. And in particular, you want to start looking at the differentiation between up and back, because it definitely provides a really nice way to navigate through your app. The last thing I guess I want to mention is the navigation bar, just before we finish this question. The navigation drawer. That's a pattern that's been around for a while, which has been formalized sort of mid 2013 by us. And that's a really nice pattern for grouping functionality or top level menus. So when we talk about how do you spot a non-modern app, to be honest, the old dashboard pattern is something that's kind of fallen out of favor, and the navigation drawer is a much better use of navigation, at least at the top level, than dashboard for many things. For starters, you're not restricted to a grid of 6 or 9 or some arbitrary number.
Okay, so as a developer, how would I go about adding a navigation drawer to my application? Is there anything we have that might help developers?
Good lead up. So on developer.android.com/design, if you look in the navigation drawer section, not only do we describe what the navigation drawer should look and feel like, we also talk about why, and we provide sample code so you can just drop that in, and it's backward compatible as well, so you can support from Android 2.2 and up, I believe. So, yeah. Might be 2.1 actually, off the top of my head. So just on the action bar, one of the things that I note that I've seen some apps do is actually provide a fake action bar, and that is something that it does give a feeling that the app is not modern, even though you're trying to be modern by having an action bar. If you can obviously spot that it's not a real action bar, it actually takes away from the experience. And there's some subtle cues that you should look at. So things like the spacing. Often I'll see that action bars that someone is sort of faking with a linear layout, the height of it just doesn't seem quite right? Yeah. You know, we've all used those sorts of apps. If you look at the spacing even horizontally of the fonts, it's not quite there. Action items, they don't quite align quite right. And in particular, the one thing that I see missing in a lot of fake action bars is the touch feedback. Because on an action bar, that touch feedback is so crucial. You see exactly what region you've interacted with. So, in terms of using action bars, our advice is either use Action Bar Sherlock, which is a very popular community effort and a quality product, and it's free. So just because it's a product doesn't mean it's not free. Or consider also using the Action Bar Compat that's coming soon from us, that we announced last year at I/O and we re-announced this year at I/O. So coming soon. But the point is, you'll soon have at least 2 choices. Right now, Sherlock is a great way to go. Yep. So we've actually talked a lot about the Action Bar, and I hope we can start to see the importance of it, at least from a modernizing point of view. Let's see if do we have any questions yet on the Hangout?
Doesn't look like it.
Just if you've just joined us on the Hangout, if you do want to ask some questions, please just let us know in the chat that I'd like to ask a question, and we'll bring you into the video feed.
Yep. So, action bars, and you were talking about touch feedback as well. So. One interesting thing that always comes up is spacing, I find, because sometimes you have buttons that are too close together, or text that is just too narrow, doesn't look right. I know we talked a bit about spacing in our dev bites. Let's talk about that a bit more. So, what would be the recommended spacing if you want to put a button on your screen, for example?
Well, the good thing is we've actually documented this on the Android Design Guidelines site. And again, there's a section called Metrics and Grids that actually tells you all about this. But there's a couple of really sort of key points that we should get across. One is that if you've got something like a list, you have a minimum of 48 dips, so that's density-independent pixels in height, because we feel that that's a comfortable sort of touch region. But even within that 48-dip rhythm that you have in the list view items, you want to have some padding within that 48 dip, so that you've got roughly about 4 dips of padding above a button, for example, and below it, so that you don't get two buttons that are so close to one another that if a user happens to hit somewhere in that unknown region, they might end up triggering the wrong event or the wrong button. So that metrics and grids page, there's a lot of measurements on there, but the ones that I love that I particularly pay attention to is the 48 dip rhythm, some of the padding numbers there around items within list views, and the one that I wish more developers paid attention to is the 16 dips of padding on the sides. And the reason for that is, as we hold our sort of devices, you kind of hold it with your hand, and you'll find that your fingers may end up sort of interacting with the screen. Now, if you've got a UI that touches juts all the way up against the edge, you can end up in a situation where the user is accidentally triggering those items when they don't mean to. So having that spacing on either side, very important. How about yourself? I mean, do you have any sort of words of advice there?
So I find with the tablet layout, so even if you don't necessarily have time to implement a full tablet layout, just adding a bit more spacing on the side, making fonts a tiny bit bigger really helps, goes a long way. So especially because if you have a long listing of text you want to scroll through, having a bit more spacing on the side allows you to hold the tablet in one hand. You can scroll through the list with the other hand. It's a good tip of advice I can give people. Yep.
Yeah, and actually to go with that, when you've got some text on a tablet, whether you've got a multi-pane layout or not, it's important to know that you kind of want to have a horizontal scan which is actually comfortable. So what we mean by that is, if you've got text that you're presenting, don't have it going from edge to edge. Have it sort of use a certain horizontal scan that allows users to go left and right very quickly through the text, even if that means adding padding on the side. And we did this in Bacon Reader actually in part 3 of this DevBytes series of making apps beautiful. You looked at that detailed view that we had. We added this padding on the side so that horizontal scan is comfortable.
It's always surprising how little you have to do to get this working, but it has a huge impact on usability and your actual design.
Right, exactly. So speaking of text, fonts. Now, one of the things we've been talking so far about measuring our layouts in dips, but fonts have a kind of special metric that you should use, right?
Yeah, so for fonts you'd use SP. And the idea is that if you basically should look at accessibility. And in your Android device settings, you can actually change the font size. Some of you might have seen that already. So you can, right now it's set to a normal 100% font, but you can make it larger or smaller if you wanted to do that. And if you stick with the SP measurement, it's actually relative based on that as well. So if somebody has enabled 150% font size, for example, your app would automatically scale up for that, and the text will automatically get bigger. So specifying fonts at SP is definitely the way forward.
Yeah, it's particularly useful for accessibility, right? Like in accessibility settings, you can set a minimum font size, and SP basically acknowledges that and applies it. The other thing that's really important in fonts, and it's one that we haven't actually covered in this particular series, is localization. Now, a lot of people think that localization just means translating strings. Often that's not the case. Often you actually need to also consider things that might be culturally insensitive as well in the content of your app. Often actually, in most cases, that sort of sensitivity is more towards games than it may be towards just a standard non-game app, but it's something that's worth considering. But the big thing that happens from localization is when you translate some of these strings, depending on the language you use, you can end up with much longer strings than is possible. I know when we did Santa Tracker, our German translations were significantly longer, broader than the English ones, for example.
So one good tip I can give you here is to load up your application Android Studio. And there you actually have a view where you can see all of the translations and all of the languages that you have available in your application. You get a fantastic overview, the same layout, the same screen, in different languages. So you can easily spot the text is cut off or it doesn't quite look right without having to click all over the place. It's a really, really good way to test this out.
Yeah, definitely. So in localization, make sure you just you test it out on your users' devices or in that user's configuration. It's really, really important. Often it's not easy to necessarily have a magic bullet for it. Sometimes you are going to get text which is just really long for your button, and you need to consider rephrasing that button so that text doesn't get truncated or doesn't wrap, and you end up with this massive button. So it is something that's important. But localization is probably one of the best ways to grow your user base, because you're suddenly making your app available to a whole group of people that may not have otherwise been able to consume that app, or may not have felt it was comfortable enough.
Yeah.
But looks like we have a couple of questions on the Hangout.
Yeah.
From
Yuri
Laguta. So, what is the best way to have Action Overflow button on devices with the menu button such as S3? That's a really good question. So, yep, there's still devices that ship with menu buttons, as well as those that ship with virtual navigation, virtual buttons rather. I think, to me, this is a bit of a choice that you have as a developer. You could the Action Overflow, typically what would happen is that it would disappear on the standard action bar, and it would show up as a menu. I think that's a fine way of using it, because that's, again, if you think about the consistency of the user experience for people on that device, they will be used to using the menu button. On the other hand, if you feel strongly about having that overflow there, that's something you can do there as well. I don't think there's a right or wrong here, but more of a preference that you can have. And you know what, with some of these things, depending on the app, it can also differ. So there's no harm in sort of doing some experiments. Things like the stage rollout feature that we've now enabled, or alpha beta testing channels on Google Play, allow you to actually experiment with a small subset of users and see, collect some analytics and see what's working best. I think you'll find that, again, there's not just one right answer for that sort of question.
Yep, that's right.
Well, I hope, okay, he said, is it okay in your opinion to have the navigation drawer and sliding pane layout, even so that they both don't use the same gestures? It seems quite similar.
Yeah, so that's always a problem if you have touch interactions in your application, whether it's a sliding pane layout, or whether it's a map or something. So there's a bit of a trade-off, right? You have to make the right decision and say, can you accidentally trigger the navigation drawer, for example, when you actually want to slide your layout? So it kind of depends on your application how users interact with it. So in some ways, overloading a gesture is not a good idea.
Yep.
Really wouldn't recommend that. Especially something like an edge swipe, for example, you wouldn't recommend that. But I've seen some applications where the navigation drawer has actually been quite successfully implemented, where it actually goes on top of the rest of the application. So in this case, it was a map, and you can pan a map, but you can still pull in the navigation drawer from the side, and that actually worked quite well because it was just triggered from the edge.
Yeah. So the edge swipe, or the bezel swipe that's become quite popular, I mean, that's a sign of times changing, right? Because users are getting more comfortable with bezel swipes across a whole range of apps, and even platforms themselves. So having those bezel swipes there is not such a bad thing, particularly on Android. That's why we have that navigation drawer icon on the top left in the action bar, to show that we have this navigation drawer available, and that you could expect that a bezel swipe would bring it across. So yeah, you're right. When you said things like a map, where you've got content that you're effectively panning around, you could think, well, will a bezel swipe trigger that the navigation drawer, or should it pan the map? If you're showing visually that you have a navigation drawer, you're setting an expectation with your user that you're going to have a bezel swipe. So consistency is probably the most important thing. So if you've got the visual indicator, have the bezel swipe there.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Well, we're getting close to the end of this, but the last two things that I think we should really cover are, we already mentioned a little bit about the touch feedback. With the touch feedback, often I see apps that don't provide touch feedback are the ones that are using really custom built controls. The reason I really wanted to talk about this is, I mean, we encourage users to have a custom style, a custom brand, but it's really important that you start with the standard UI controls, right, and then customize it rather than build it from scratch. Because again, with the standard standard UI controls, you do get things like touch feedback, and it's not just visually. It makes if your user's enabled, it also makes that little audio click as well as you interact with it, and you just get this feeling. Sometimes it's intangible that, hey, this is something that feels familiar to me. So whilst it's great to sort of style your app, what you should do is be using our styles and themes to do it, or extending our standard UI controls rather than building them from scratch. You'll find in general your interaction is generally much more defined that way and consistent again.
Yep, that's right.
All right, well, it looks like we're out of questions, and we're also out of time. So thank you very much for joining us. We'll have 2 more episodes of the DevByte series, Making Apps Beautiful, coming out over the next couple of weeks, and then we'll be back for another Backstage to answer your questions about the rest of that series. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
See you later.